Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Beth Hawley with the Arizona Association of Realtors, and we're proud to bring you these free, hot, and timely webinars designed exclusively for Arizona Realtors. Today's webinar is What Comes First, the Cure or the Breach with Jim Sexton. Jim is a longtime broker in the Valley. He's a past president of AAR, a member of the AAR Forms Work Group, also a current AAR, NAR, and Armless director, and a managing broker of Realty One Group's Paradise Valley office. So today's presentation will be about 35 to 45 minutes. If you have any questions during the webinar, please write them in the question box and we'll try to get them answered at the conclusion. As always, today's webinar will be recorded and available next week on our website at aaronline.com. So welcome and let's get started.
Very good. Thank you, Beth. I appreciate it. Based on our initial poll question, it certainly looks like folks have done cures. So I guess we do have a timely topic. It seems like C, failure to comply with paragraph 2D, get the loan docs to title, unfulfilled loan contingency, or receipt of the CD is a leading candidate at this point, followed closely by D, letter D, failure to receive paperwork, whether it's the SPDS, insurance claims history, or HOA doc. So I appreciate those that have checked in and are going to participate via the question box today. So that's good, and it certainly helps the feedback. We did ask for and receive a number of questions before we start today, so we're going to cover the questions that we've already received. And as we receive questions throughout our session, Beth, please, get it out there and let's see if I'm either going to answer it or have answered it.
Sure.
So, again, thanks all for being here.
Great.
So let's start with another poll question. If people can type in the answers to this, I'm just curious, the number of deals, let's just take the last 90 days, that have closed on time. So in your business or in your office, what percentage of deals have closed on time? And let me give an over-under. And let's say how many have at least 50% of our deals that have closed on time. If you could type in some results, please. At least 50% of your deals have closed on time. That would be a yes or a no.
Getting lots of yeses. Yes, 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 yes.
Very good, very good. Okay, so how about the number of deals which have closed without a cure? The number of deals which have closed without a cure. And let's say at least 70%. So if we had at least 70% of our deals have closed, again, in the last 90 days without having to issue a cure. Yes or no?
Lots more yeses.
Very good, very good, very good. Okay, so how many have had, let's take a crack at how many, the percentage of deals that have canceled. How many have had more than 20% of their transactions cancel in the last 90 days? More than 20%.
Lots of no's.
Well, that's good. We're talking about a minority here, so that's a good start. And of those that canceled, how many canceled with a cure versus canceled with, say, for example, an unfulfilled loan contingency? So did they cancel with a cure? If you had any cancellations, did they cancel with a cure? Or let's just go ULC, unfulfilled loan contingency. Cure, ULC.
ULCs seem to be the predominant answer for that.
All right, great. Thank you. All the people that I called beforehand and told them how to answer my initial questions are coming through. And so the topics, so I'm on track as far as what the topics are going to be and what they're going to cover today. So if we get started with slide number 1, you're going to help me out here, slide number 1, which might be our critical. This is the answer. Okay, this is what we were doing. Okay, sorry, I already answered slide number 1. What am I pushing? Okay, I can do that. And let's take a look at the critical date list. So when Barb asked me to talk today, part of my let's organize the presentation was pulling out the critical date list, because the critical date list contains all the possible cure notices or opportunities that we have to cure. And if you take a look at it, we have 19 opportunities just on the contract alone. So there's 19 items that buyer and sellers have said they're going to comply with when they enter a standard Arizona residential purchase contract without making changes to the boilerplate. And then if you add in the addendums that we might see throughout the transaction, whether it's the on-site wastewater treatment addendum, or the well addendum, or even, for example, a lead-based paint or homeowner association addendum, those add another 9 potential cure notices. So let's go through this a little bit and just see if we understand the process and understand how and when to issue a cure. Oh, I'm sorry. We also need to start with the concept of, is issuing a cure bad? If I issue a cure, does that mean the deal is going to cancel? Or is it either agents, is it their obligation to keep the deal on track and to make sure that people are following the transaction appropriately? The key to a successful transaction, in my opinion, has to do with communication between the agents. And if the agents aren't communicating, if the agents are playing lost in space or not returning phone calls or messages, it becomes frustrating to the other side. And the successful transaction really requires frequent communication as to what's happening and where are we going with this, and is your buyer performing and are we on track, et cetera, et cetera. And so whether we're going to focus in on the inspection time period or we're going to focus in on the loan process, both of those have items that need to be covered and then responses that are necessary to be covered. So understand that issuing a cure shouldn't be a bad thing. It's best to give the other side a heads up that, oh, by the way, my buyer is a little bit nervous about not having received the SPDS, not having received the insurance claims history, or whatever it might be. And so he asked me to issue a cure. Is that okay? Understand that it's coming, and we just want to, kind of keep this on track. And hopefully the other agent acknowledges it and, gets that paperwork back in a timely manner. One of the questions that we were asked and frequently get asked is, well, okay, so you issue a cure, and now the cure is issued. Can you help me count to 3? He waits and says, okay, how do we count to 3 when it comes to a cure period? Well, of course, the contract kind of prompts us in a couple of places how to help us out. And so if you take a look at calculating your days in the purchase contract, it's going to actually help you with that. And that's going to be paragraph 8I. And it talks about the day that the cure is delivered doesn't count. So day 1 is the following day. And so obviously you go all of the following day. And so if we issue a cure on Monday, let's just do that. We issue a cure on Monday. Day 1 is Tuesday. And so that's the first day that the item that's been cured needs to be fixed. If not, we'll go to day 2, which would be Wednesday, and then we'll go to day 3, which would be Thursday. So if the item in the cure is not fixed or not addressed by the 11:59 p.m. on Thursday, then the deal is potentially, can be canceled by the non-breaching party. So understand that Monday doesn't count. Tuesday's day 1, so it's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and now the deal can be canceled on Friday in the event the item hasn't been addressed. And that information, again, is on 8I of the purchase contract. So let's take a look at the first item as we look at the critical date list that can be cured, and that's the earnest money. The recent purchase contract was changed, so the earnest money is now to come from buyer directly to, in most cases, a title company. And it needs to be done in a timely manner. And so then what's timely? In some cases, buyers have already indicated that, oh, by the way, I'll wire funds in 2 days after I return home, and here we are accepting a contract on a Saturday, and so I should have funds to you by Wednesday. And if the seller is okay with that, and Wednesday comes and goes and still no funds, obviously Thursday can be the opportunity to cure, just to remind a buyer that, oh, by the way, we're waiting for earnest money. And so that cure would be issued on Thursday, if that was the case, looking then for Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And since Sunday, title companies are closed, that one would roll over to Monday in order for the earnest money to be delivered to title. And so earnest money is was one of our frequent answers for our initial poll question. We take a look at some of the other ones. Was a loan application done? Did they give permission to access credit? But then here's the first one. Has the seller delivered the SPDS, and was that done within 3 days? And so again, these are all items that need to be handled, and they're contained in the purchase contract. And the next one is, as well, is the insurance claims history, et cetera. The next two have to do with HOA. And then let's focus a little bit on the LSU. Okay, so we get the transaction started, and the earnest money is now in escrow. That's a good thing. And the buyer has at least met with the lender. And so now we're looking for the LSU, and just to make sure that the buyer has started the process and hopefully is on the right track. So that's that's one where it's a buyer to seller document. Where are we? Is the LSU going to match the pre-qual form? Are there any items that create issues that we're going to be concerned with? And where are we as far as those conditions it might be? Are we on track, et cetera? So that's the first one. If we go to the next slide, we'll pick up some of the next items. And has the buyer delivered? Have we received the BINSR, for example, and do we have a response? And number 18 is the buyer has provided the lender with notice of intent with the loan in order to get the process started. And one of our writing questions, which I'd like to address at this point, which I thought was a good one, but it's kind of, and it sort of shows how, in some instances, we have a lot of agents that determine that the best way to proceed with a purchase contract is to interpret what the boilerplate means ourselves. Not always the best or the correct interpretation, but here's one that kind of takes us all over this. Here's what I think this language means. And the question is, so if the information on the application was falsified, do you issue a cure or can you cancel immediately? This was a married man who wrote as an unmarried man and neglected to indicate his down payment was coming from a note and deed of trust. And obviously that didn't mature in time. So the seller was upset that the buyer wasn't being forthright, and he really didn't want him to give an opportunity to cure the problem. Which is, okay, so that's the question. So where does that leave us? Well, first of all, the question becomes, is the buyer going to qualify for the transaction? Have we gotten to the point where the buyer has been denied the loan, and therefore was he unable to qualify because he either didn't qualify or because he didn't have the down payment? And so in the event he didn't have the down payment, what does the contract say about that? Down payment is not an unfulfilled loan contingency. Down payment is a breach of the contract and does not qualify as an unfulfilled loan contingency. And so since he's missing funds in that scenario, that's going to become a problem. And and I'm looking on line 29. Failure to pay the required closing funds by scheduled close of escrow, if not cured after a cure notice is delivered pursuant to 7A, shall be construed as a material breach, and the earnest money shall be subject to forfeiture. So here, assuming the buyer didn't qualify, and the reason given is because he didn't have the down payment to qualify, the contract does say that the seller is going to cure, and that in the event it's not solved during the cure period, that the buyer's earnest money would be subject to forfeiture. And let me stop there and go over one other situation as far as the contract's concerned. Are there any automatic breaches, or is everything a potential breach that requires a cure to take it to a breach position or to take it to a default situation? And the answer to the question is the contract is full of items that will lead to a potential breach, but you need to cure the potential breach in order to take it to an actual breach situation. And so there's not any that I'm aware of that are going to be automatic breaches. And then you get feedback about, well, what about time is of the essence, and you're not closing on time, et cetera. So even if we're talking about closing on time, that's still a scenario that requires a 3-day cure period to give the buyer the opportunity to perform as we get to that point. So understand that that's how that works. So hopefully I addressed the question. Again, there's a lot of facts. You can feel the emotion in the question, and the fact that the seller is just totally upset with the buyer. And In the event he did have the down payment but couldn't qualify because he failed to disclose that he was married or unmarried, obviously you're going to get to the diligent good faith effort discussion as to whether the buyer would be entitled to a refund of the earnest money or not. There's one other question that I got that's relative to at least this time frame, and it has to do with the appraisal. And again, this question leads us to people interpreting the contract themselves. Have you ever had a discussion where the other agent says, well, I was at this class and the instructor said, boom, boom, boom. And all of a sudden, what did the instructor say? Well, here's, I think, an example of how what an agent heard might be misconstrued as you apply it in a different context. Here's the question. If the appraisal is not completed within the time frame specified in Section 6A, and 6A is the inspection period, 6A, let me check that, is the inspection period, is that a breach of contract and would a cure be valid? I had an agent state that due to the fact that line 215 mentions value and line 216 states lenders, that the appraisal should be completed within this time frame, otherwise it's a breach. First of all, otherwise it's a breach, it would be a potential breach if it applied, but in this case, this is a bad application of what that language says, or a bad interpretation. This is the first time I had an agent state that appraisals needed to be done during the inspection time frame. Okay, so let's address, in my opinion, let's address the correct way to answer the question. Number one is, I think that the agent heard that in the event you have a cash sale and you want to get an appraisal, you better get the appraisal during the inspection period, otherwise there is no appraisal contingency on a cash sale. And so since I heard that in a class that, oh, the appraisal has to be during the inspection, I'm now going to apply it on a finance sale. But does that apply on a finance sale? And the answer is, well, there's a paragraph specifically talking about the appraisal contingency, and it indicates that the buyer's obligation to complete the sale, and this is paragraph 2L, is contingent on an appraisal of the premises acceptable to the lender for at least the purchase price. If it fails to appraise in any appraisal required by the lender, buyer has 5 days after the notice to cancel the contract and receive a refund of earnest money, or the appraisal contingency shall be waived unless it's prohibited by federal law. So the appraisal is a loan contingency, and it's controlled and directed and ordered by in the combination of the buyer, the borrower, as well as the lender. So it's not something that has to be done during the inspection period unless you specifically write it in. And obviously, most people don't write it in to say the inspection to be done during the appraisal will be done during the inspection period. So hopefully that addresses that question. We've got a few more on the critical date list to look at. And let's take it down to, let's see, 27. Buyer has the funds in escrow to allow COE to close. And let's assume the funds are in escrow to close, but now the buyer is unhappy with the final walkthrough. And I did get that question. And the question sounds like this. So the timing of the walkthrough, let me check this. Yeah, okay. So the timing of the walkthrough and cures, and what to do about a scheduled fund transfer and timing is curing. For example, if I'm a buyer agent and the house has not had the bins or repairs done, or has been damaged by storm or vandalism, so it's not an acceptable condition at the walkthrough, which was done 3 days prior to scheduled COE day, do I withhold the funds and issue a cure along with an addendum extending COE to have to give them time in order to fix, or what's the correct order or procedure? So first of all, what do we have? We have the fact that the seller says they were going to make repairs and the seller didn't make repairs, or perhaps the seller made the repairs and there was additional damage after those repairs were made. So the first step would be to cure. And obviously the buyer pre-closing walkthrough is the form that would do that. So you would fill out the form, and actually I think we have Well, that's later on. But we do have, so the buyer pre-closing walkthrough has the box, the option 2, which says that they're in substantially the same condition, but however, the seller, and here are a couple exceptions that that haven't been made or that the buyer doesn't accept, and it also serves as a cure. And so this can be done the 3 days prior to scheduled closing, or it can be done the day before closing or the day of closing. And then the question becomes, and what's the buyer going to do? And is the buyer going to hold up closing waiting for the items to be repaired? You recall when we started today's class, we took a couple of polls, and the polls came in that we have 70–80% of our transactions close, over half certainly close on time. And so it's not every file or every transaction that we get down to this, but we certainly, I'm sure, bump into the occasional difficult buyer and or difficult seller, or the seller that's backed up because he needs to close before he can move, and does he have the money, etc. So hopefully we've had some of this communication, not just with the other agent, but with our client, in order to address some of the potential issues when we're trying to do simultaneous closings. And so, and like I said, hopefully we're anticipating that this might happen, or this could happen, and if so, the buyer is at least then aware that what the scenario is going to be. So the question becomes, can the buyer hold up closing pending the repairs? And the answer is it depends. I mean, can they? Sure. Should they? That answer is it depends, and it depends on the value, the dollar amount of what the repairs are going to be. I've had buyers refuse to close over a couple of dripping faucets, which would be repairs in the neighborhood of $5 or $10. That I don't think works very well. But then other buyers have decided that the pool pump that wasn't working is something that felt material to them and that they wanted to have specifically addressed and confirmed prior to closing. So there's different repairs that people might want to consider, and that they should be aware of, and understand what's going to happen. I've also had buyers that refuse to do the final walkthrough until the house is vacant. And is that an obligation? Is that something that's standard is that something that's anticipated as far as the purchase contract is concerned? And the answer there is obviously it's not anticipated that the house is going to be vacant. The house is not the buyer's house until recording. And if you can't get to recording, then it's never going to be the buyer's house. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg argument as far as which comes first and how do we proceed from here. As I was digging through the archives of legal hotline questions, which, oh, by the way, is an excellent source when you're having an argument or you're having a discussion. Excuse me, we never have arguments. We have communication with the other agent that perhaps might disagree or might be wrong. And the question becomes, how do we get off dead center? And how do we decide who's right, who's wrong, and how are we going to get this transaction closed? You go to AAR online and you type in some of the questions, and it's amazing the answers that you can get, and the scenarios. So now you have a impartial third party that's giving you an answer. That's giving you the answer. For example, here's a recent legal hotline question on point. Does the property have to be vacant for the final walkthrough? And the answer is the seller is obligated to make the premises available for all inspections and walkthroughs upon reasonable notice by the buyer. The seller is also obligated to have all the utilities on, including propane, until close of escrow, to enable the buyer to conduct the inspection and the walkthrough. The purchase contract only requires the seller to grant buyer reasonable access to inspect and to ensure that all repair items are in working condition and the property is in substantially the same condition as of the date the contract was accepted. There is no requirement that the property be vacant for the final walkthrough. So if that is a requirement of the buyer, I mean, it's something that is best to be broached with the buyer early on and let them understand how it's going to work. And the buyers that I found that have this as their requirement or their assumption, it's amazing. It seems like they've already had a loan delay, maybe 2 or 3 loan delays. So the buyer thought the seller thought the transaction was going to close on the 30th of the month, and gives them an extension to the 7th of the following month, which they don't make, and then it gives them an extension to the 10th, which they don't make, and gives them the next extension to the 14th, which now they make, and they want the house vacant before they'll do the final walkthrough. And the seller says, really? You put me through this hoop once, twice, now 3 times, and now you're making demands that aren't even in the contract. So be careful if you bump into those. And again, find something in writing or give Legal Hotline a call in order to help you through that, that situation. So let me see. I've been stuck on this page for a while, so let's try the next page and see where else we're going to go. And the cure period notice, obviously this is the document that we use. It can be issued by the buyer or seller. It does need to be signed, and it's going to specifically state what is being cured. And additionally on this, let's see what's being cured, and again, communicate to the other side that it's coming, and make sure that that they're aware of it, and that everybody agrees that when we're on the clock and when the clock's going to expire. The next one is the unfulfilled loan contingency notice, and I think that was a popular way that contracts were canceled. And so this technically isn't a cure, and nor is it a breach. It's just a notice that, oh, by the way, the buyer can't get the loan. And so the buyer states they're unable to get the loan, and this is usually has a credit denial letter attached from the lender. And this is pretty clean cut, and is going to get the buyer is going to get the deal canceled in most instances, unless, of course, you come up with scenarios like the buyer didn't have the down payment, like we talked about before, and that's why they couldn't get the loan. Or the buyers didn't block the interest rate, so now the interest rate went up. So that becomes problematic. Let's take a look at a couple of Q&As and see if we agree or disagree with, or see if we can, and see how we would answer. So the scheduled close of escrow is Wednesday the 15th. The transaction fails to close on that day, but and the buyer broker is missing in action. And so let's see. So what do we cure, and how is it going to go? So the buyer qualified for the financing, but for other reasons was unable to close the transaction. On Thursday, March 16th, does the seller, issue a 3-day cure period? And if so, what are they curing? And so let's think about that for a second. So we've got buyers failing to close, and best of our knowledge, we feel that the buyer has qualified, but the buyer broker is missing in action, and the lender is nowhere to be heard from. So the best cure in this scenario is going to be, I just tell people to cure 2B, the entire paragraph, 2B. And 2B of the purchase contract has 3 items that, in effect, you would be curing. Number 1 would be failure to sign loan docs 3 days prior. Number 2 would be deliver the unfulfilled loan contingency if you can't get the loan. And the third one would be, have you obtained loan approval without prior to document conditions, and have you received the closing disclosure? So the answer to this question is cure all 3 items, because you want the deal to close in this case, and you want to make sure that where the buyer is in this whole process, so that you can go, you can get it to the point of seller getting earnest money or buyer getting earnest money if they don't perform in a timely manner. All right, let's try the next question. And the next question is, AAR purchase contract. The close of escrow was scheduled for, we're on June 19th. On June 22nd, the seller issued a cure for a buyer, a cure notice pursuant to Section 7A for the buyer's failure to close and failure to sign loan docs. The cure period expired without the buyer signing loan docs and closing escrow. After the cure period expired, the seller receives an unfulfilled loan contingency notice from the buyer. Is the seller entitled to the earnest deposit? Okay, so I get an unfulfilled loan contingency, but I get it after my cure expired to either sign loan docs or close escrow. And the question is the seller entitled to the earnest deposit? And the answer is yes. Seller gets the earnest money because the unfulfilled loan contingency needed to be given either during the cure period or prior to during the cure period or 3 days prior to closing, which is exactly what paragraph 2B states. Again, these are questions that are available on AAR online, legal hotline. So the next one is other potential cures. So I think we talked about no earnest money was deposited. What should be done? It should be cured. When should it be done? In a timely manner. If the buyer is communicating, if the buyer broker is communicating, and if the buyer is communicating with the buyer broker and it's coming, it's in the mail, or they're dropping it off today, you're good for a time or two, but after a while, enough is enough, and you need to hold the buyer's feet to the fire regarding the earnest money. No SPDS or the insurance claims history. Those are important disclosure documents. Obviously, the SPDS is required within 3 days, and the insurance claims history within 5 days. And so I would get those cured promptly if they're not received, because if you don't receive it within 3 days and you cure them, you're giving them another 3 days to give it to you anyway in the case of the SPDS. And the no LSU was received. You're already 10 days into the deal. You want to find out how the buyer's loan process is progressing, and so it's best to get that taken care of. Here's one that comes up, and I think it's a good one to have reference for, because every once in a while you bump into a transaction in which the utilities aren't on when the buyer's home inspector shows up at the property. So on the 8th day of a 10-day inspection period, and after the listing broker was given notice that we're doing the inspection, the utilities were off. When the buyer broker contacted the listing broker apologized and said that the utilities would be turned on the next day. The listing broker said that the buyer now has 2 days to complete the home inspection. The buyer broker said that because there was some time delay in getting the home inspector back to the home, that they should be entitled to the full 10-day inspection period. And is the buyer entitled to the full 10-day inspection period? Well, first of all, although I'm having the conversation, I would cure at the same time, letting them know that I've given you notice that the utilities were not on. And Legal Hotline gives you that definitive answer that starts with a P and ends with a Y, probably. But in my opinion, the buyer is entitled to the full 10-day inspection period because the seller had not performed and had the utilities on. And you don't always have an inspector that's able to be rescheduled for the next day. And the fact that it took you, 8 days to get them out there in the first place would lead one to believe that you're going to have a similar period for that. So if the time period is going to be, again, going to require the full 10 days period, then state that in the cure and make sure that both agents are on the same page. The rest of the Legal Hotline answer is the seller had the obligation to have all utilities on from the date of acceptance of the contract until close of escrow to permit the buyer to complete any necessary inspections, and that's 6M of the contract. So due to the failure to comply with the contract, the buyer should not be prejudiced by limiting the time necessary to complete the inspection, and the buyer should have the full 10-day inspection period. In the event the buyer doesn't need the 10-day inspection period but needs 5 days, not 2, then obviously you can have the discussion along those lines as well. So let me try one more question, and then Beth, if we've got stuff that I need to answer, let's do that. So this one is, we've signed the contract. At the time of the contract, the spa was working. 1 week before closing, the seller notifies the buyer that the spa is not working. Is the seller obligated to repair the spa? And the answer there is, what? There's no warranted items? What do you mean repair the spa? And whoops, Jim, don't do it. Don't do that. Not everybody can tell when you're joking. So in this case, the spa needs to be returned to the condition that it was at the time of contract acceptance. The property was sold in its present physical condition, and since everybody knew the spa was working at the time of contract acceptance, it needs to be working. It needs to be working at the time of closing as well. So there would be, again, an example where the buyer broker would issue a cure. The cure has to do with the spa to be in working condition, and give the seller 3 days to repair that. Whew. So Beth, what else we got? What else we got on the folks' minds?
Well, we need a clarification. Let's see, going back up to earlier, there was a question about the SPDS, you said it was 5 days, but someone's saying, no, that's no longer true. It's 3
Correct.
days.
If I said 5 days, I was referring to the insurance claims history, which remains at 5 days, but correct, the 2017 version of the purchase contract requires the SPDS to be delivered in 3 days. Sorry.
So what is the timeline for the buyer to lock in the interest rate when, and then when do you issue a cure notice?
Well, you're not going to issue a cure notice for the buyer to not lock in the interest rate. The contract says the buyer is the one that's going to take the risk in the event they choose to float the interest rate and not lock it in. And so paragraph 2D deals with the interest rate, and it says buyer agrees that the inability to obtain loan approval due to the failure to lock the interest rate in points by a separate written agreement with the lender or the failure to have a down payment necessary to close is not an unfulfilled loan contingency. So the buyer is basically risking their earnest money if they don't lock in and they're then unable to close. That's not going to be an unfulfilled loan contingency. Fortunately, we haven't seen a significant change in rates in a while, and so we haven't bumped into this, but obviously we continue to hear and see the pressure of interest rates increasing, but we haven't seen significant movement in that 30-year mark in quite some time, so we haven't bumped into that. But the seller can't force the buyer to lock in. It's a buyer choice, and the buyer runs the risk of earnest money at risk in the event he doesn't lock and he's then unable to qualify.
So what happens if you are not able to get your hands on the HOA documents? The seller isn't providing them, the HOA isn't providing them. What do you do?
Yeah, well, that's a cure. And you would go to seller, you would go to title, and you would ask who's going to provide them. Understand there's 2 levels. Number 1 level is less than 50, and then or more than 50. And more than 50, usually there's a management company that's going to provide the information. And under 50, then the seller is responsible for gathering up and bringing it. Another question. So how do you do it? Understand that once you cure, everything stops until the cure is resolved, until the paperwork is delivered. One thing that I've had happen recently has to do with you get 6 out of the 12 categories of necessary HOA documents or disclosure. And so wait, now what do I do? Am I curing for the other 6? And the answer is yes. You need to cure, because if you don't get everything that's included, you can't make the informed decision of, am I concerned about, has there been proper disclosure? So understand that when you take a look at the HOA addendum, and page 2 has all the stuff that's required by law, and there's actually 8 items that are on the list, plus dated statements with all sorts of contact information and all. And so if you don't get all of those things, and they're not the current version of all of those things that included on page 2, then the buyer should definitely cure to say, yes, thank you, I've received 6 items and I'm waiting for the other 2, just to let the parties know.
So do you need an addendum to extend an inspection period?
Yes, an inspection period. Again, the boilerplate is going to be whatever is on there. Currently, it's going to be 10 days. In the event you get to the end of the approaching the end of the inspection period, or either the seller reply or then the buyer reply to the seller's response, and you need some additional time, you would issue an addendum. Understand an addendum is a request until it's been signed by both parties, and once it's signed by both parties, then it does modify the contract. It does apply in the contract, but the fact that the buyer might request an additional 5 days for an inspection and the seller doesn't allow it or doesn't sign it or acknowledge it, then it doesn't exist. So the buyer's sole option would be, to cancel in the event the addendum hasn't been signed in a timely manner by the seller. Oh, but it's coming. Oh, he's out of town. Oh, he's unavailable. Yeah, but if you want to protect your buyer's position, you need to keep the time periods in mind and take action in a timely manner.
Can you clarify section 5A? Does it say that the home should be vacant by close of escrow, so it should be vacant for the final walkthrough? That's
5A
5A.
or 2A? Where are we?
The question said 5A. I'm not really sure.
Well, possession is going to be 1E. And so here's one. Let's see. So I have another. Did I read the? Let me see what I have. Okay. So I'm sorry. Read the question again.
The question states, doesn't Section 5A state that the seller will have personal property and debris removed earlier than close of escrow, meaning a vacant walkthrough can be cured prior to release for recording? And then also he has follow-up for under warranties.
Okay. So and well, that's a good question. But again, when is it the buyer's house? AAR, each time we take a look at the contract, we try to determine if it's possible to tie down closing and possession more than we already have it tied down. And again, if the contract is going to be used as a weapon, for example, an offensive weapon, and that I'm going to make you do this, and so that I can create a win, usually it's going to be at somebody else's expense or a loss for the other side, and the transaction probably has gone sideways a time or two. I always feel that the day of closing is a combined day of ownership. And in fact, it is by definition, because the seller owns it until the until the property is recorded. And I think if I took a poll right now and asked if anyone has ever had a scheduled closing postponed or delayed, the answer would be yes. And if the postponement has been from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., that doesn't sound like a lot, unless and until the seller was waiting on the proceeds in order to get to the next place, or in order to pay the movers or something to that effect. And so there can be extenuating circumstances. So the day of closing, although the buyer owns the property at the time of recordation, the seller, it's not unusual for the seller to stay in the property or to be in the property for a portion of the next few hours. I always take it to they better be out before it gets dark, because usually sheriffs and police and all sorts of folks get called and get to sort that out. But again, the communication is going to be between the two agents is when is the seller moving? Will the seller be out? If the seller isn't out, or if there's been numerous delays based on the loan process, hopefully your last extension included either some sort of a post-occupancy agreement or some sort of a spelling out that the seller will need 4 hours after scheduled recordation in order to vacate the property. And it's just the way it is. We can't get it any tighter and still have, we hope that we can have peaceful, calm, rational discussion in order to decide how to get the seller out and the buyer in as quickly as possible after closing finally takes place. Sorry that I don't have a better answer than that.
So about closing, can you cure after closing?
Yes, you can cure after closing. And a couple of things, for example, here's one that, so in the purchase contract, the refrigerator was to be left for the buyer. And at the walkthrough, prior to closing, the refrigerator was still in the home. After closing, the buyer discovers that the refrigerator has been taken by the seller, and the buyer delivers a 3-day cure notice to the seller. After the 3-day cure period, the seller still refuses to deliver the refrigerator to the buyer. Can the buyer cancel the contract? That's the question. And the deal's already closed. So the buyer isn't going to be able to cancel the contract after closing, but the buyer, the buyer would have a claim against the seller for damages. However, the cost, and it would be for the cost to replace the refrigerator. And so, technically or legally, the buyer couldn't cancel the transaction, but they could discuss rescinding the contract. And if we're getting into rescission of the contract over a refrigerator, we're dealing with people that are way too uptight regarding the real estate transaction. Because trying to rescind a transaction is something that, in my experience, is going to take anywhere from 6 to 18 months. Will cost, depending on the dollar volume of the transaction, $50,000 to $100,000, and to be on that path over a $1,000, $2,000, or $3,000 refrigerator is crazy talk. So hopefully we can solve that in a different manner.
So there's always some confusion about the timing. So say close of escrow is today and they're not out, you issue a cure at 5 p.m. and then exactly how much time do you give them? They have 10 days to resolve. When does the countdown start?
Sure. And again, I'll go back to trying to create the document that's going to be able to close 80 or 90% of all transactions in a peaceful, clear manner. And then you get a party, be it a buyer or a seller, that decides that they want to change the deal unilaterally. And so, yeah, I said I was going to be out, but I need to stay an extra day, or I need to stay an extra 3 days, or my house isn't ready, so I need this much time. And, I've cooperated with you for your delays, and therefore it's time to get even. Bad scenario, and it's a bad situation. And it's really something that is outside, in my opinion, the course and scope of a regular real estate transaction and of a real estate agent. In my case, the situation gets escalated. It goes from agent to broker. It then probably is going to go from broker to the other broker, which means we're going from buyer agent's broker to listing agent's broker, and decide and discuss what's going to be done and what the scenario is going to be. If it can't be resolved at that level, then, in my opinion, the buyer broker needs to inform the buyer that it's time to get legal advice and it's time to escalate the scenario. A cure, in my opinion, would be given, and the cure is obviously to deliver possession. Whenever I do a cure, whenever I talk to an agent about doing a cure after closing, I'm always going to plug in things like estimates. And so let's assume that the refrigerator wasn't there. And so I'm going to give you a cure after closing, and I'm going to say that the refrigerator was there. I found a comparable refrigerator, and it's $2,500. And in the event the refrigerator isn't returned, I will purchase this refrigerator, and I will pursue you in small claims court for the $2,500. If the seller doesn't give possession, and so I'm curing for possession, I'm going to state that, oh, by the way, my wife, 2 kids, and 4 dogs have a problem finding a hotel. We found one. The hotel is going to be $300 a night. And just to let you know what we'll be pursuing you after closing for your failure to deliver possession in a timely manner. So you're on the clock. I expect possession per the terms of the contract. And here are the damages that I will be incurring, that I will be looking to you to cover until you're out of the property. I think it kind of adds some. It adds a dollar volume, and it adds some motivation for the seller to decide if he's going to make up his own rules or not, and if so, is he going to be held accountable for the damages that he's causing the other party. So yeah, the timing is something that, although we continue to discuss, we have been unable to come up with an answer. Sometimes we even talk about, well, it's a wild, wild west. Maybe we should talk about, guns, bow and arrows, knives, whips, but decide that in a civilized society, we should discuss it and talk it out and let the courts decide who's right and who's wrong and what the dollar amount might be.
Sounds like a better idea.
Yeah, me too. I agree.
So we are running a little short on time. Do you have any last thoughts on best practices?
I like that slide. Let's talk, let's communicate, and that's whether we're expecting documents or whether we're expecting performance in a certain matter. You know, it's not unusual for me to have a conversation where I hear that the other agent asked me to give them a cure just to be able to emphasize to their client, whichever the reason is, that this is important and this is a contractual term that we previously agreed to, that the other side is relying on. So effective communication, constant communication, and effective communication is certainly a key to keep the transactions on track and to keep our percentages as high as they were when we started our session today.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I feel like that was a good clarification on something they deal with every day, so that's great. And thank you for joining us today. Our next webinar is Building a Powerful Brand and Online Reputation, which will be on July 26th, and we hope to see you there. So have a great day.